Hi, I'm going to do a tutorial on how to Dockerize the Angular application with Json server on the backend. For the application, I'm not going to build from scratch. Instead, I'm going to use this Angular crash course by Traversy Media. He made a great Angular course on how to make the front end, and using the Json server, he serves the backend. If you want to know more detail about the code, you should definitely look on his video, and his repository has all the codes. So I'm just gonna clone this repository and start from there instead of starting from scratch. I normally use WebStorm, but I would use VS Code for I guess most of you are familiar with VS Code, so I'll just use VS Code for this project. And I already have a few folders. I'll make a new one: demo, docker, angular, something like that. Okay, and I'm gonna open this directory, and I am going to clone the repository from Brad Traversy. So what I can do is open up terminal and check the directory I am in. I'm at this directory. I just do git clone that, and now I have a folder Angular Crash 2021 here. So that's where I would like to start. A few things I want to change is I want to set up a Git repository to kind of record all this. So first of all, I'm gonna delete the previous Git repository inside the Angular Crash 2021. I'll do yes pipe remove r.git. So with this command, I'm just removing all the Git inside this folder, and I'm gonna cd back to the demo docker angular, and I'm gonna initialize git init. And now I have my Git repository. I have my Git initialized in the root directory. And let's see, I would like to create a new repository for this project. And you can go to your GitHub, and the name was demo docker angular, I believe. Demo docker angular, yes. And create. And I just did init, and I can add everything. Git add everything, git commit message, initialize the project from copying. There we go. And I am going to add the remote repository and git push origin. Yeah, let's do that. I will push this to the I'll just push to the master branch. Okay. The reason why it gave me error is because here I'm supposed to branch to the main and push it to the main, but I'll just use the master branch. If I refresh my repository, I have this folder with all the same code from the Git repository from here. Okay. So before we start Dockerizing, I would like to check if this code really works. So I would go to the Angular Crash repository, and first thing I have to do, if you read the README file, you have to do the npm install, and then to run, you do the serve, and to run the backend server, you do the npm run server. Very simple. I'll do install, npm install. It is going to install all the node modules that is necessary for the Angular and Json server. Okay, I have all the packages installed, and Now I have to do npm, no, ngserve. It can be ngserve or npm run start. It's the same. Npm run start. Then it will run the Angular server. And in the meantime, I'm going to open one more terminal. And I am going to run this command, npm run server. npm run server runs the JSON server, watching this database.json file on port 5000. Okay, so I do that. Okay, I forgot to change directory to this directory. And I run again, and it is working now. So on my Chrome browser, I go to 4200, and I have the application running. And obviously, my port 5000 is serving the JSON server, and task, it is returning all the JSON format response that I need. If I go to network here, if I refresh, we can see that we're getting the response back from 5000/task. Okay, very simple and nice working. So now we confirmed the web application is working. Now we would like to Dockerize this. So before Dockerizing, it seems like there's a little change on the log file. I don't know why. Let's just commit the changes that happened. So yeah, the name Angular crash was added. Okay, this is not so important, but I'll just add Angular crash. Now I'll just commit, and I'll move on to Dockerizing the front end first. Okay, so for the next part, Dockerizing, for Dockerizing, I'll first work on the front end part first. So I'll add a file named dockerfile.dev. I'm specifying dev because I want to make a development version and a production version separately. So for development version, I would like to use Node version 14.7. And I am going to define arg called workdir. Workdir, okay. And I'm gonna specify workdir to /frontend. And I am going to add environment variable path with workdir/node module/.bin at path. This command is basically adding the all the modules that I can use inside the .bin file. So for instance, ng is here, so whoops. So one of the modules here is ng, and ng is used for ngserve and so on. So if we don't add this, we are not going to be able to use ng, but instead we can use like npm run start, I believe. But for simplicity, I'm just gonna add this. So if you forget to add these, if you're not gonna be able to use ng on your Docker container. And next is to make directory called workdir. So this is basically the same thing as this. So it's making a root front end directory. Next is to set a work directory, and I am going to set working directory to this /frontend. And I would like to copy these packages file from local to my container, package.json, and I want to copy them to my work directory. And same thing for the lock file. Okay, and next thing I am gonna do is npm install Angular CLI and npm install, yes, these two. And then I am going to copy the rest of the source file to Docker container. The reason why I'm copying this later is because if I copy this and then install npm, and if there's a change within my source files, it's gonna detect as something changed, so it's gonna execute the npm install again. So if we copy these files first, then the dependency will be installed first, and it will only run the npm install only if there's a change in packages instead of the source. If you want to know more about it, maybe you should try putting this here instead of these two lines and see how long it takes. And then I have to expose the port 4200 for the Angular. And finally, I want to cmd ngserve and host 0.0.0.0. Okay. And that's it for the Docker file. But one thing we have to make sure is to add a Docker ignore file, because if you don't specify this, it's going to copy all these node modules, and we don't want to copy node modules that is already in the local development environment. So I'm copying all the git ignore to Docker ignore, so it doesn't copy the node module to the container. Instead, it's going to copy these packages and reinstall it inside the container. Okay, cool. And I'm gonna close the Angular and JSON service. So see, nothing is working. Okay, it's all closed. And now, since I have the Docker file for the Angular, I am going to run this Docker container. Docker run, I'm going to remove after it's finished. Port 4200, I'm going to map the same port. And then I have to build this Docker file. This queue option returns the hash file of the image, so it runs after building immediately instead of putting tags on the image file. And then F for the file option, because we are not using Docker file, instead we're using dockerfile.dev, so we have to specify that, and dot to indicate that the context is in the current directory. And if I do that, it will build this front-end development image, and it will run on port 4200. Okay, seems like it is building, so it means it's installing all these packages again, so it might take some time. So I'll come back after the installation is finished. Okay, now it seems like the Docker container is running on port 4200. And I will open up my Chrome browser again to see how it is. Okay, now we see the front-end application is running, but obviously we haven't run the backend JSON server, so it's not fetching the JSON response. But we can check that the application's working. And it is working on inside the container instead of using our local development environment. So that is good. So we will add all the changes and commit. I'll type Dockerized Angular development application. Commit. There we go. So that is good. Now we would like to have a backend as well. So okay, now next thing we're gonna do is create a directory. I would say JSON server. And here I first of all I would move this db.json to JSON. Let's just copy here, and then add a Docker file for backend service. So for this backend, we will use Node version 14.17 again. And let's see what we have to do. First of all, we have to install the JSON service. run npm install. I would do it just globally so I can use the JSON server right away instead of assigning the environment path. And I would use work directory / backend and run make directory. I am making the / backend directory and set the work directory to work directory and copy database.json to the working directory JSON. And I want to use port 5000, so I export that. And finally, JSON server host that port using 5000. And I would add watch command to check db.json. So any change on this db.json is going to be reflected. One more thing, to be able to use the variable in the cmd command, I have to actually add into the env. So this has to be that. The names are same, so it's kind of confusing, but actually this and this are the same thing. So let's say ABC, it will work the same way. Yeah, work the IR is fine for both for now. Okay, now I save that. And let's run this Docker container. Before that, I'm going to check. So the Angular server is still working, but the backend is not working. 5000 is not working. And I have another terminal. I am currently in the root directory. Change directory to JSON server. Docker run remove port map 5000 and Docker build q dot. In this case, I'm just using the Docker file, so I don't have to specify the file. And I execute that command, and it should build this image file. Oops. Okay, using 5000. Something went wrong. Yep, there was some issue with my port 5000. Somehow it was being used, but I just killed all of them. So if you happen to be using port 5000, you can map to different port, but just make sure you use the same port on your source code. Here, app service, task service. Here we're using the port 5000. So if you want to change this port, yeah, make sure you change the port here too. But anyway, I solved my port issue. So if I run this, it should be running. There we go. And I am going to check my 5000 task, and it is working. If I refresh this, yes, we have all things running back again. So back to my file, I have these two files, db.json and Docker file. And any change to this file is going to be reflected. Nope. It is not going to be reflected, of course, because the file in my local repository and the file inside the containers are different. So yes, it will not be reflected. And if I terminate my container, it will remove all the containers, so the changes will not be saved once I run the container again. Okay, so now that we checked 2 container is running and the application seemed to be working fine. Next, we're going to make Docker compose file. But before that, I am going to commit all the changes. Dockerized JSON server and commit. So for next stage, I would like to make a Docker Compose file. And make sure you terminate your container. I already did. I usually use my Docker desktop to stop and delete all the container. So you can see nothing is running right now. And for the Docker Compose file, I am going to use version 3.9. I believe this doesn't matter. I copied from the Docker Compose website, so it seems like the version doesn't really matter. I'm gonna create a service name Docker frontend and specify the build context and the directory name Angular crash 2021, and then I have to specify which Docker file I want to use. I am using the docker file.dev and specify the port. I am using port 4200 in this case, so I'm mapping the port. Next is the volume. Volume is basically binding the volume to the container volume. So I would like to bind the source file to the container inside as well. And it was front end inside front end and slash source. So basically this means any change on this directory source is going to be applied directly inside the container. Next thing that I need is the backend service, Docker backend, and same build. Instead of Angular crash, it has to be Json-server. And Docker file is just Docker file. And port, I need a 5000. And the volume that I want to mount is a JSON server to backend backend, yes. Because I created the slash backend working directory. So basically any file in this directory is going to be reflected on the Docker container volume. So we can keep the database JSON file the same on the local and the container. Okay, so that's for the Docker Compose file. Open the terminal again. And from here, we can simply type Docker Compose up. And it should run both of them. Since we didn't change anything on the Docker file, we can just do Docker Compose up. If you happen to change something on the Docker file, you can always put the build option behind. If we execute this command, it will create a network default network. So these two containers are in the same network, and it is running both the JSON service and the Angular front end at port 4200. So let's go back to the Chrome browser, and we can see that it is working fine. So we have both the front end and the JSON service running. Okay, now I am going to commit the change, Docker Compose file. Okay, now before moving to production, I would like to show that what is this volume thing doing here. Let's start with the database db.json. So here we can see there are 2 true and 1 false. And on the web application also, there's 2 true and 1 false. So if I double click this, the changes are going to be reflected to our local file as well. So now we have 3 trues. And if I add one more, test, check, save. And here we have also test, and true. So this is pretty nice feature to have. And same thing for the Angular source file. If you go to source, component, header component HTML, we can see here the title task tracker is being used here. Well, let's say we type test here and save. And as you can see, the changes is automatically applied. So we can view on the Chrome browser without building the Docker file again. So this is very nice to have. You're running everything on your Docker environment, but your changes on your local file is going to be reflected on the browser and container right away. So that is nice. I'm going to delete that test. And on the db.json, I'll just delete this. So, yep. Okay, so that's good. So that is all good for the development environment. And now we are going to move to production environment. Let's close everything. And let's start from front end. Actually, backend is just going to be the same, but we will use the ng build to build a production static file and serve that in a nginx image container. So first of all, I would like to start with the environment. For the task service, we can see the API URL is hard-coded here, but I would like to use one for development and one for production. So instead of using this one, I am going to specify this URL inside a environment, and I'm going to use API URL to this string. And from the task service, I am going to import the environment from source environment, or I can do 2 directories above environment. And here, instead of using this, I'm going to comment one. I am going to use the environment.api URL. So this value comes from this file. And for production, it will bring a URL from here, but we will specify that a little bit later. So that is good for the environment. And next thing I want to do is I want to create a nginx folder with nginx configuration. So nginx is a web service that serves static file, and it also has a feature for doing reverse proxy. And I'll explain little by little. So first of all, I just copied the configuration that I already have, and I'll explain line by line. So it's listening to port 80. That's the default port for HTTP request. Server name, web, doesn't really matter. And anything to this location / the root directory is going to serve the file from user share nginx HTML. And I will explain this a bit later. And the proxy, I will explain about the proxy. So the concept of proxy is to not show the user where the backend is, but instead the nginx is going to fetch the backend for you instead of you going to the backend directly. And doing that makes your backend kind of secured. So doing that is going to make your backend a bit more secure. So my proxy path is going to be /task. So any requests coming to this /task. So for instance, if we access to localhost /task, we have to proxy this to a certain URL that we have to proxy to the backend URL. Until now, our backend URL was localhost 5000. So if we do that, then it will go to this URL and fetch the JSON response back. But unfortunately, we cannot use the local host here because we are running two separate Docker containers, one for Angular and one for JSON. So we have to specify the path for the JSON server. I'll come back to this in a little bit later. And now I will create a Docker file for production. For production, it is kind of similar to the development version. So the difference is that we need a two different stage for building the Angular file and serving the build Angular file in Nginx. So as before, I will use node 14.17 again, and I am going to specify a stage here, and I'm going to name that stage to builder. So what builder is going to do is build the Angular project. And I also want arg of work dir, but I want to share this variable between multiple stages, so I will declare work dir in the very front, and I want to use the directory /build. So I did that, and if I do this again, I'm just using that from here. Next is environment path. Let's just copy from here. I want to copy this, I want to copy that, and that. Okay, so all these are same, but before we used ngserve. Now what we're gonna do is ng build in production. So by doing these commands, it will build the Angular project into a static file. And where it is going to build is written here on angular.json. Output path is dist/angular-crash. So we have to make sure we use this path. And we specified next stage, which is going to be using Nginx. I will just use the latest image. And now I want to copy the static file from the builder stage. So here I can use the --from, and stage name is obviously builder, where we are going to copy from. And the file is inside the work dir /dis/angular-crash. This is where the static file is going to be outputted, and we would like to copy into directory where we specified. So here, user share nginx html. This is where the static file has to be. So we copy this and paste here. So we're copying the static file that was built from the builder to our new nginx container into this directory. Next, I would like to copy the nginx configuration file that we just wrote. This file, I'm going to copy this to our nginx container and copy it to this directory, and it will replace the default configuration. And since we are listening to port 80, we have to expose the port 80. And finally, run nginx with this command. So with that, we have the production image ready. But we still have to figure out where the backend is going to be. So this really depends on how you run the backend server. But as we did with the Docker Compose, we are going to create another Docker Compose for production environment. So for that, I'm gonna copy everything from the development, and this is a production environment using Nginx. So I want to rename the service to Nginx frontend, and it will use Docker file instead of .dev. And port, we need port 80, and we do not need the volume mount anymore since we already built the production file. For backend, things are going to be the same, but we don't need to map the port 5000 anymore. And here I am going to change the Docker backend to, say, Json backend. So now this name Json backend is important for Nginx config. And instead of localhost, we will replace this by Json backend. And we will run the production Docker container. So to summarize again, we are running the front end using the production image, and production image, it will build the Angular and it will copy to the Nginx, and Nginx will serve the front end. And inside Nginx, there is a proxy. When things are when requests are given to this /task, it will forward to this HTTP JSON backend port 5000, which is served through the Docker Compose for the backend, JSON backend. And one more thing before running the Docker Compose, we have to edit the environment for production. So here, since we gave the proxy to task, we no more can use the port 5000, but we have to use localhost /task. And I save this. And I'll run the production Docker Compose file. Okay, Docker Compose F for file. I'm using the production YAML file. Up and build. So now it's creating another container for the building. And as it did before, it is installing all the dependencies first. It will install the dependencies. And after the dependencies are installed, it will build the Angular file into a static file. Okay, there's an error. It's because here I haven't specified the arg here, because it's reading the arg from here to here, but I haven't specified here, so it doesn't know where. So it is telling me that this directory doesn't exist. As you can see, it's /dist/angular instead of /build/dist. So if I add this, it should be able to build. I will run again. And the thing is, every time I run, it is going to execute the ng build command, so it will build the static file again, even if there's no change. But since we have everything cached here, the packages didn't change. It won't install the dependencies. So now it seems like things are working, and my backend is running, and my front end is not running somehow. Okay, seems like there's an error inside my config file. I believe I forgot the semicolon here. So I will save that again, and I have to build again. So each building takes quite a bit of time, so make sure you don't have any typos. This is my third trial, and of course it's building the static file again. Okay, now it's working. The Nginx server is running and the backend server is running. Let's go to the browser. And this time, instead of 4200, it's the port 80, and we can see that things are working. It seems like it's exactly the same as the development version, but I'll show you what has changed. So on the network tab, if we refresh, we can see that the backend JSON response is coming from localhost/task instead of localhost port 5000. And if we double click this, we can see the JSON response. But if we try to access the port 5000, you won't see anything because on our Docker Compose production file, we never exposed our port 5000 here. It's gone. So instead, how the Nginx is fetching the JSON response is to using the proxy pass. So let's go back to the browser. So things that are being requested to tasks is actually being proxy pass to this JSON-backend at port 5000. Since Docker Compose within itself has the shared network, they can communicate to each other. But from user, we are not able to access the port 5000 directly. Okay, so that's good. So I will commit all the changes. I will add all of them and say production environment for Angular project. Okay, and I commit that. So things are working. And next I'm gonna explain more about how this Nginx thing is working. So first, I would like to explain about the development environment first. So as a user, we are accessing the Chrome browser, and we are accessing the port 4200, localhost 4200. And since we mapped our port 4200 to 4200 inside the container, it will forward that, and from our Docker container, it will return all the Angular stuff. And it will return the screen that we see, and also it is going to tell the JSON response is coming from API URL localhost at 5000/task. And the Chrome goes to the backend server to port 5000 and gets the JSON response back, and it will display on our screen. That's how it works for the development environment. That's why we can have direct access to port 5000. But let's try this case when port is not mapped to 4200, but instead we change the access port to 3333 and the backend 4444. So now we're back. I am going to stop my production environment, and let's open our Docker Compose for development. And as I said, I'm going to change the port from 4200 to 3333, and for the backend 4444, and save that. and Docker compose up, and it will run the development environment again. And it seems like the backend is running and the front end is about to be ready. So let's open up our Chrome browser and let's try to access 4200 first. And obviously we're not going to get anything because we haven't mapped the access point as 4200. Instead, now we have to access to 3333 instead. And we see that we are able to see the front end part, but we do not have the JSON response or the tasks displayed. And before we were able to access our backend through port 5000, but obviously 5000 is existing nowhere. So we instead have to use the 4444. And now we see our backend working. So go back to 3333. So seems like the backend is working, but why aren't we getting the response back? It's because we specified the API URL to localhost 5000 in our Angular app. Let's go here, Angular source app services and task service. We're actually using the environment. So let's go back to environment. Here we specified that if you want to get all the JSON response, go to port 5000. And the Chrome went to 5000, but the 5000 is not running, so it's not getting any response back. So let's try to change this to 4444, and I save and it updates. And now we get all the responses back. So from this, we can see that instead of the web service fetching the data for you, it's actually us fetching the data from the backend. I'll change back to 5000 and nothing is going to be working. And I will stop the server. And on the Docker Compose file, I'll change it back to 5000 and 4200. Okay, now back to this slide. Once we change the port map to 3333 and 4444, we were not able to access the web through the previous port, but instead we had to use the 3333. And it returned us telling that we have to access this localhost 5000/task to get your JSON response. And we did, we tried, but it didn't give us anything. That's because we're supposed to access to 4444 because we changed, but instead we're still trying to access 5000. So that's why we were not able to get our response back. Okay, so back to production environment, I would like to explain in a diagram again. So as user, we use the Chrome browser to access to the local host with port 80. And Nginx server will return us the Angular site. And it will tell us to access localhost/task for all the APIs for the JSON response. And it's kind of like this. It's not exactly like this, but it goes back to localhost/task to the Nginx server. And once the Nginx receives the path/task, it will forward to the proxy and it will send your request to JSON backend at port 5000. And it will send a request to the backend with port 5000, and it will give you back the JSON response to the Nginx, and Nginx will give you back your responses. So in this process, as you can see, there's no direct access from your user to the backend directly. So in this way, the user doesn't know where the backend is, and there is no possible way for user to access the backend directly. Okay, so back to the production Docker Compose file. We'll run this. And let's open up port 80 again. And as you can see, there's a request to localhost/task. And again, if we access here, it means that we have sent a request to /task, and from Nginx, this path /task is forwarding your request to JSON backend at port 5000. But in this process, we don't see JSON backend nor port 5000. It's all handled by Nginx, and all the requests is sent back to Nginx to you. And that's it for the tutorial for the Angular, how to Dockerize Angular application with JSON server. I'm thinking of doing more of these kind of series using Python. Using Python Django or Java Spring. So if you're interested and if you'd like to follow up, please hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks.